Welcome to Amazing People number 7. I'm here with the amazing Chris Miles. I say he's amazing because he has traveled the world. He's a genius. He knows a little bit about everything and a lot about architecture. He is an architect, and he's one of my good friends that I met at Toastmasters. And we're going to talk about his life, his travels, his ideas, and whatever else we want to talk about in the scope of this interview. It's not scripted. We're just going to go with the flow.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Jay. And welcome to Golfside Drive, which has been my home for 40 years. And in that time, it's been modified. Basically, we've grown 2 children here, and today they're in the outer world, one living in New York, and with a 2-year-old baby. And the other one has about a 1.5-year-old baby. And my wife and I basically probably stay here until it's time to go into some old person's home or something.
It's a beautiful house, and it has a sort of a classical, to my eye, architecture.
Yeah, it's very much, I mean, the interior is, it's a Californian wood frame house, but the interior is European. And particularly in the kitchen, which is sort of Provençal, and that's the way that we like it. So it's basically full of quite a lot of antiques, and these antiques all came from England. We've got a Napoleonic officer's travelling case, which actually travelled with the French army during the time of Napoleon. And a couple of chairs, or rocking chairs, are from 1890, and they're rather special. They will kill you if you sit in them, but they're quite fun. And around you see a lot of books.
Yes, you said there are 3,000 books in this house.
3,000 books in the house, and
print books. Yeah,
printed books. And just as a matter of interest, we had a neighbour who came in and said, I love how you've done the books. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, those are not real books, are they? And I said, of course they're books. He thought they were spines. You know, you can buy spines.
To make yourself look more erudite and well-read.
Once he figured out that I read the books.
So have you read all 3,000 of them?
I read all 3,000 books. So having read all 3,000 books, it automatically moved me to being not exactly the next door neighbour. I was some sort of professor or something of that sort.
Yeah. Well, your knowledge base is definitely very expansive, and that was one of the things that really impressed me when we started talking 7 or 8 months ago.
Well, I was very lucky because I grew up in England. My father and mother were both fairly bookish. My father worked for the university, for Oxford, and he was what they call a reader. And a reader is basically an editor, and his primary job was correcting giant manuscripts. Some of the manuscripts, which today are big books, I've got one upstairs, which is the Oxford Companion to the Theatre. And in those days, before there were computers, you had to go through and verify endless facts, which meant being on a telephone, tracking people down, writing to them and everything.
Facts for what, when you're at the university?
Facts that were basically in a kind of a dictionary of the theatre.
Okay.
So they're called anthology, and basically everything you've always wanted to know about the theatre, but been too afraid to ask.
Okay.
So his role was very much, you can imagine him with one of those green visors, you know, sitting under a lamp. So he read copiously and got very involved in printing, which basically ultimately became the profession and the way that the family made money. Okay.
Was this when you were growing up or before you were born?
Yeah, this was when I was growing up. And after World War II, because of World War II, actually, I was born in the north of England, but I was never a Northern Englander. I was always from the south. And the accent, if you listen to the accent carefully, it's a Southern England accent.
Your accent?
Yeah.
Okay.
And it basically hasn't changed very much living in America for 40 years. Except
Right.
that I think that I basically speak with using American language, not accent.
What is an example of a shift you've made?
Well, there are a lot of changes in words. Obvious, if you take the railroad, it's a railway.
Okay.
If you go to a station, you stand in England. You stand on a platform.
Yeah,
You don't
I
stand on a track.
platform. Have you read Harry Potter?
Exactly.
Platform 9
Platform
and 3.
9 and
Yeah,
whatever.
3/4. Yeah.
Exactly. So,
The word makes sense when you translate it over, but an American would never think to say that word.
well, that's true. And I mean, basically, there are still English words in American that are fundamentally much older than they are in England. When they came here, when they in the 18th century, and basically they stuck. So people wear hose, for example, whereas in England you wear something else. And where women, for example, put a ladder in their tights. Okay, well, it's a different kind of use of language. And I think if I go back to England, people know that I'm not from England anymore.
Because
Even-
you don't make the transition back when you're there.
No, you don't really make the transition. It's not quick enough
Okay.
to make the transition. So effectively, you are speaking American with an English accent.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's how I would kind of say, but
Yeah. Well, I know you've been all over. My world travels
Yeah.
encompass India, Sri Lanka, Canada, and Argentina.
right.
And you must have done maybe 5 times more than that.
Well, more than 5. Total of 120 countries in the world.
So like 25 times more than that.
Well, it's probably getting on for about over a third, maybe moving towards a half of all the countries in the world. There are blocks where I've traveled hugely, and then there are other places where I've traveled by accident or by job, and there are places still that I would love to get to, and probably will never get there because when you reach my age, which is 75, you get to the feeling that you can't go everywhere still.
Right.
You've got to be selective.
Yeah.
So my main travel, setting off from Europe, obviously living in Europe, early travel was very much in the countries fairly close to England, the Low Countries like Belgium and Netherlands, France, and then little by little going into Austria and Italy and Switzerland and venturing further and further afield. And by the 1960s, probably 62, 63, is when I first started interfacing with the Mediterranean, which is my great love. The other countries travel a lot in Africa. That quite surprises me how much I have traveled in Africa, having crossed part of the desert by camel with the Tuareg, who are the blue men of Morocco,
Okay.
and worked in Tunisia, traveled all the way up Egypt as far as Lake Nasser.
So has it been architecture that's been your primary work in all these places?
Well, actually, yes and no. I qualified in architecture and basically applied art, which really means basically sort of graphics, because in those days everything was drawn, everything. So not only did you draw the building, but you drew all the lettering and you drew all these prescriptions, and everything was hand drawn. So part of the class of architecture included life drawing and modeling, which today is probably not in the typical architectural lessons.
Mm-hmm.
And because of that, one learned skills like model making,
Mm-hmm.
which is very important. And when I came to qualification, I was basically dropped off by my father in the middle of London with enough money to exist maybe for about a week. And he said, you know, from now on you're on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And how did I get a job? How can I get a job? And there was very little work in architecture. And this is, I'm talking about 1966.
Mm-hmm.
There was extremely little work as an architect.
In London or in general?
Well, in general, probably in England.
Okay.
Just going through a
But
kind of low moment.
Recession, or was it just lack of
Yeah, there were
lack of space, or
constant recessions in England.
okay?
One of the reasons eventually why I left
Mm-hmm.
is that England could never really stabilize, could never get into a position whereby it was continuous growth.
Mm-hmm.
So even though you've had depressions here in America, they weren't as bad as they were in England.
Mm-hmm.
And so every time I got a company going, it was going for a couple of years, and then I got knocked back by a recession.
Mm-hmm.
So early on, I basically was fortunate of getting a job in the film industry.
Okay.
And as luck would have it, I worked on some award-making films,
Mm-hmm.
one of which won the Venetian Lion.
Mm-hmm.
These were animated films, and two of the main designers of this particular firm, called Hallis and Batchelor, they basically suddenly left. They decided to form their own company, and I got rocketed to become head designer of the largest animation firm in Europe
Okay.
within a year and a half.
So you were what, like mid-20s or something?
Yeah, I was
Mm-hmm.
25 or 26, something like that. And that was amazing because it put me in touch now with a lot more famous people
Mm-hmm.
around me. And that was important in resume building.
Yeah.
So I worked for about a year and a half on Lone Ranger and Tonto,
Which is
which is an animated series of American films
mm-hmm.
starring the masked man. Remember the Lone Ranger,
Okay.
and Tonto, his sidekick. And we made, I think altogether I made 60 films before I actually left the film industry.
Were you a drawer in those
Yeah.
films, or a creative thinker? Or?
Yeah, I was a creative interpreter.
Okay.
And my role initially was to read the script, to storyboard, which basically to image in a small way what would eventually be part of the film, the
Mm-hmm.
scenes of the film.
Yeah.
I also drew the backgrounds, and I planned the backgrounds. So effectively I planned the camera movements, and I planned the position for characters, and got very involved in that.
Mm-hmm.
And then one day I was very fortunate, I got called up by a friend of mine who said, "Do you want to work on the Yellow Submarine?"
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Wow, you mean the Beatles?"
Right.
And they said, "Yep, the
It was
Beatles."
It was their fourth movie.
Yes,
Although,
exactly.
as you told me, they weren't involved in this one.
Well,
Except
they weren't really involved because they had already a contract.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like making films, and they had a contract that basically obliged them to make a fourth film. And came a possibility to take the money that was originally destined for a whole series of short films
Mm-hmm.
and put it all together and make into one film.
Yeah.
And the one film, in order for it to be a feature film, it had to be an hour and a half long.
Mm-hmm.
And animation in those days was like architecture, was entirely hand-drawn.
Right.
Virtually nothing mechanical or photographically possible with other techniques.
Well, and just to distill that more finely, that literally means every motion that you see is a series of like many drawings that everyone changes ever so slightly, and then they move in rapid
That's
succession.
correct. Yeah.
I learned that from Mickey Mouse with the black and white ones.
Exactly.
But and I saw Yellow Submarine when you showcased it at this local theater, and the animations are beautiful and great, and I can't imagine the production of that.
Well, you have 24 frames in a second.
Mm-hmm. In a second, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So we used to shoot on what we call twos. So you think and one is a second. So you basically have 12 drawings.
Mm-hmm.
And some of those drawings are held, so they're not necessarily redrawn every single time. But other pieces like the face or the eyes or the nose or the mouth or whatever, they're moving. And they're moving roughly in twos, as in other words, 2 frames a shot. Click, 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 click,
Mm-hmm.
click, click. And in that way you get fairly smooth animation.
Right.
And so basically to make a 90 minutes of film involves, in our case, probably 30 to 40 animators working for nearly a year.
Mm-hmm.
And my role on the Yellow Submarine was basically one of being a kind of unit director, but also working with Heinz Edelman, who was the graphic design director, German director,
Mm-hmm.
who had actually invented all the characters, the interpretation of the blue mealy and the apple bonkers and the yellow submarine and so on. Those were his imagination. And it was our role to animate all those characters and make sure that all of the work of these different animators looked like the work of Heinz Edelman.
So he thought of it and told you how to make it, or did he have concept drawings that you had to then expand
No, he
upon?
started off with a whole series of still pictures, still
Mm-hmm.
drawings, that we had to go back and imagine how they would be moving
Okay.
within the film.
Okay.
And so from the storyboards, again, the storyboards are the picture script, if you will, for the film.
Okay.
So in order to get an understanding of where a character needs to be within the frame, there are many drawings which are thrown away.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these drawings were little more than pencil sketches, and they are basically beginning to define this character is going to go here,
Mm-hmm.
the camera is going to move in here, this object is going to happen here, people are going to appear from the background, and it's pretty complicated because you've got to understand there are different levels, up to 8 different levels on cells which are moving against a background.
Well, and also it needs to all fit in the concept, in the structure of the script. The mouth needs to match
Exactly,
the dialogue,
exactly.
and maybe the voice acting wasn't done at this point.
No, exactly. So that's why the whole process of filmmaking is completely in reverse. So what happens is the script is recorded. So you and I right now are talking, and our talking is measured in terms of seconds.
Mm-hmm.
And it's broken down into a thing called a bar chart. So as I speak, in the chart it would go I speak down a long line, okay?
Because that's how many frames it-
S-P-A-A-K, and it will be timed, so it takes me a second and a half to say I speak,
Mm-hmm.
okay? And so that basically is more than 24 frames to get that across.
Mm-hmm.
So I speak, the mouth is moving in a different way in order to pronounce that. So there might be 3 or 4 different mouth movements within that 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
And every single animation sheet basically records that by seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So at the end of the day, we were very lucky if we could produce about a couple of minutes of film a week.
Mm-hmm.
Couple of minutes.
Right. Well, the total film was really good.
Well, it was.
The animation part was
surprising.
good.
It sums up the period of the time,
Mm-hmm.
and I was very much part of that. So, if I can move on from filmmaking, I left filmmaking predominantly because I worked in the dark. I went to work in the dark. I worked in the dark, and I came home in the dark.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked like a kind of a ghost.
Mm-hmm.
And plus, it was round the clock,
Mm-hmm.
literally 12 hours a day. We were under huge pressure to get this stuff out,
Yeah.
and it pretty much burnt me out.
Mm-hmm.
I made a lot of money from it. Well, not a lot of money, but I made pretty good money.
Mm-hmm.
And I set in my mind the idea that I would go and use that money and go to Greece.
Was this the first of your outside of the local Europe travels?
No. I'd already actually been in Greece when I was at college.
Okay.
And I fell in love with the Greek islands, or those that at that time that I knew, when it was the old Mediterranean. And I think that's a subject which would be fun to talk about.
Okay.
But basically,
I've never been, as you know.
well, when I say the old Mediterranean, I mean the countries of the Mediterranean before tourism.
Okay.
So in the early 60s, when there really weren't yet tourism, there weren't huge hotels, there weren't mass travel, there were package tours didn't exist.
And McDonald's.
Yeah, and McDonald's didn't exist. Well, it did, but it wasn't, wasn't particularly around. The countries of the Mediterranean, Spain, Italy, and France, and Greece and Turkey, very much on the northern edge of the Mediterranean, were very much unchanged for the past several hundreds of years.
Well, they must have had certain modern things, right? Like medicine and.
Well, they did, but they were fundamentally poor because it was an agrarian economy.
Okay.
Greece has never really produced very much in the way of anything that anybody wants to buy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of olive trees and certain amounts of lemons and various other things, but basically Greece has been struggling, as most of the southern Mediterranean countries have struggled,
Mm-hmm.
to get an income.
Mm-hmm.
And so the people were dependent upon fishing
Mm-hmm.
and local agriculture.
Okay.
And I just happened to arrive in the early 60s on an island called Andros, not very far from Athens, but a world removed, and a world which was still full of basically fishing village, where nearly all the men involved in the village were fishermen who would go out and work all night pulling nets.
Is that a nighttime job?
That was a nighttime job.
Okay.
And
Because of dawn and dusk, that's when the fish spawn.
yeah,
or
well,
something?
the fish, and the Greeks also have these things called carbide lamps,
Okay.
which are big lamps that shine during the night, and fish get attracted to them.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
So there's carbide fishing, and then there's net fishing. So the nets will be laid out, and then you basically anchor or you just drift, and in the morning you pull the nets in.
Mm-hmm.
And in those days, there was still plenty of fish, big fish. And so people, the entire village could live off the fish, or a few fish could be exported to other parts of the island. But basically, it's a self-contained agrarian economy.
Economy aside, I mean, there's something that sounds really very nice and simple about that,
It was
which
very simple.
maybe what attracts people to go visit.
Yeah, I think that was the amazing thing. Of course, I went there in good weather, and to be truthful, the Mediterranean is good. If you want good weather, you go there for 6 months. Start in the spring, and by October, normally storms are coming in, and the whole environment changes. But I had already, in a sense, fallen in love with a simple life, which was a complete opposite to the way in which I lived in London. So
Because you were working in the dark and around the clock, and
yeah, and
on all these
because
big projects and stuff.
and because London was frenetic.
What does that mean?
Frenetic means
frenetic.
Frenetic, yeah. I mean, London was sort of crazy.
Okay.
It was good crazy, but at the same time, where we worked in London was, and this actually turns out to be very fortunate in my career, was that architects and artists and filmmakers and graphic designers and interior designers and furniture makers and everything, all in the same part of London. So nearly everybody in a way was creative. And we used to meet in pubs, and you could probably easily get a job just by drifting around the pub.
Networking.
And networking.
Yeah.
And that was pretty much how it worked.
Mm-hmm.
And that gave me an introduction in a way to the next phase of my own particular career. Because after being in Greece for about 9 months, in 1968, I came back to London, and I interviewed with Sean Kenny, who was in those days the most famous theatre designer in London.
I know that I was in acting school for a while,
Yeah.
and what I learned is that in England, they respect live theater more than they do in America. Was that the case back then as well, or is that a more modern?
No, I think that's true, because in England, you don't have to be beautiful to be an actor.
Mm-hmm.
So the Hollywood concept of, you've got to be good looking, perfectly good looking in order to be an actor. If you look at British films, you'll see many people who are, quite frankly, quite ugly. Mm-hmm. Or they represent ordinary people.
Right.
They are ordinary.
Right.
But
in that respect, it's more realistic to how the scene will look in real life.
Yeah, I think the tradition of, and this is a long-standing tradition, is the tradition of the actor in England goes way back to the medieval mummers, we'll call them mummers,
mm-hmm.
and also to the period of early Shakespearean troupes that basically were paid by royalty to entertain them. And so the idea of travelling theatre, which really was very strong within England, gave the idea that it was a real profession,
mm-hmm.
but a kind of different profession, not a film profession, but a walking the boards profession. And Sean Kenny, who I worked with, I was really apprenticed to, he was a mentor. He was an Irish stage designer, architect. He trained at Taliesin West with Frank Lloyd Wright. And he came back, practiced in Ireland and then in England.
Mm-hmm.
And the great advantage for me was that surrounding him were a lot of very famous wannabe actors.
Mm-hmm.
People like Sean Connery and Orson Welles, all kinds of people who I had the chance to meet.
Mm-hmm. This was in the late 60s at this point.
This was actually in the end of '68, going in '69.
So 68 was an eventful year for you.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, it was an eventful year in many ways. It was a terrible year. It was a year in which there was a virtual street revolution in France, when Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy was killed.
Why was there a revolution? Why was there riots in France? I know in America there were.
Well, there were same reason really. I mean, young people were totally upset with the political environment. At the same time, the Russians invaded. They came into Eastern Europe, invaded Hungary.
Okay.
And so there was a tremendous amount of bad stuff going on.
What's so nice is that while all that stuff was happening, on the other hand, you have the Beatles, and you have Yellow Submarine, and in the Yellow Submarine movie, I'll just summarize in a minute. These meanies come into the city, and they freeze everybody, and they get rid of the musicians and all that. And then one guy escapes on a yellow submarine, and he goes and finds the Beatles, and the Beatles are off doing whatever they do, and he drags them back to the city.
Right.
And most of the film is the Beatles' journey there, and it's like they're going through this ocean of space, and they see all this crazy looking stuff, like a dinosaur eating a fly, and then a fish turning into a dinosaur, and stuff like that. And the Beatles songs play, and they come back to the city, they play their music, and then immediately all of the people that got frozen get unfroze, and love comes back into the area. And that's one of the things that I've loved about the Beatles so much. They've touched me in my heart more than any other musician, and I'm not contemporary to their time, but what they brought out within me is some of the best stuff I've ever felt.
They very much symbolized in the way that we were on the outside as well. You've heard about flower power, and a lot of the young people, and probably myself at the same time, we tended to be very floral, very different from the ordinary guy in the street. We wore flamboyant clothes. We wore very much big floral shirts with rounded collars and big belts and flappy jeans and colored
I'm imagining this. Yeah.
Colored shoes and everything, and we were involved in. This was really, I want to say, not really a drug scene. The drugs were coming later.
Okay.
But people still, when I was at college, I was fundamentally, I didn't see marijuana. Okay, I was not aware of marijuana. I mean, we used to get high on sherry.
What's that?
Sherry is a sort of a Spanish wine. Kind of rough wine. And although people smoked, they were not particularly smoking marijuana. At least I wasn't aware that they were smoking marijuana. So the people of the creative world of London, which was then regarded as one of the most creative places in the world, basically were interfacing and sharing ideas. And so an idea might grow out of a filmic idea, would become a piece of furniture, or a piece of furniture would give an idea to some kind of architectural volume, or whatever.
That sounds like a good thing to form the basis of thinking of a creative like you.
Yeah, well, I think that was everybody. There's very, very few totally original ideas. I mean, nearly everything I've ever done in my career, in a way, has been suggested through somebody else, or has been seen through something that is actually already designed. Occasionally you get designers who will work in a purely new way, like, for example, the Art Nouveau period, where people like Charles Rennie Mackintosh, who was a Scots Art Nouveau designer who really was very different, had a completely different way of looking at architecture. And going back to Sean Kenny had a completely different way of looking at the theatre. So up until Sean Kenny's period, which really predates when I'm working for him, and sets him back in, say, into the late 1950s, 1958, 59, he had the idea that a set should be open, not held behind a curtain. So the traditional theatre set was a series of flats which came down over the stage.
Mm-hmm.
And you were looking through a gap which is called a proscenium arch, and every now and again the scenes change, the curtain closes and there's a new set. And Sean was interested in kinetics and interested in moving components.
Mm-hmm.
And so he began to explore the possibility of turning turntables and sets which are on trucks which can revolve. And that gave way to Oliver, which is the stage production of Oliver, and still regarded as one of the world's great stage experiences.
Could you refresh me on Oliver? I learned about it when I was in elementary school.
Well, it's a Charles Dickens story of a young boy who's basically in the poorhouse, and he grows up in a very east end of London.
Mm-hmm.
And he is basically virtually tortured by living in a poorhouse.
Okay.
He's deprived of food and.
Is it in the 1850s or something?
Yeah, that would be around the right period of time.
Mm-hmm.
It was in the area of London called the Rookery, which actually existed on Gin Lane, where basically all the people were thieves.
Okay.
So the story of Charles Dickens' sort of story was interpreted by Lionel Bart as a musical. And so in the musical, the young Oliver basically rebels against all of this, and eventually he triumphs and becomes, a different kind of person.
Is this the same as Oliver Twist?
Yeah, it's the same as Oliver Twist. Okay. Yeah, so the story of Oliver Twist was adapted for the stage. This is prior to the film.
Okay.
And Kenny's set, which is a treble revolve, where the actors actually change from scene to scene, walking through the set.
Mm-hmm.
So the set's moving.
Okay.
And as they climb stairs and so on, they're taking off their old coat and they're putting a new coat and so on. So that there is never a formal closure of one scene with the next.
Mm-hmm.
So Kenny became really interested in this idea and bursting the grounds of theatrical experience. And I joined him exactly for the first 2 months going up into Christmas '68, where we designed Gulliver's Travels.
What's that?
Well, Gulliver, you know the story of Gulliver's
I
Travel.
don't.
Well, Gulliver is a seaman who gets basically cast away on a different island, and every island he comes to, the people are either much smaller than he is, so he's huge.
Mm-hmm.
So they're called Lilliputians, little tiny people, or he escapes to another island where the people are much, much bigger than he is. So there's constant change of scale. So a story by Jonathan Swift is the story of Gulliver and his travels through these different islands. And it was produced as a children's play.
Okay.
And Kenny and we, working for Kenny, basically designed the very first set that were ever using projection for the sets.
Mm-hmm.
So there were huge screens on the stage. These screens could go downstage, upstage, and you could project graphics onto the screens. So you could project a shipwreck, you could project the soles of huge feet, and we used models, and we used to scale robots and to a lot of filmic stuff to basically show the change of scale.
That sounds great, and I like. I've been to theater a decent amount, and what I learned in acting school is that all these emotions that we feel, whether it was people acting in yours and Sean Kenny's productions years ago, or people today or in the future or in the past, regardless of who you are, where you come from, what your situations are, we all feel the same range of emotions. And a good theatrical production will elicit that from the audience.
Exactly.
And that's what people go there to see.
Yeah, and so basically Kenny not only was stage designer, but also he was trying to invent new personal experiences. In one particular case, in the year before I joined him, he designed a project in Montreal for Expo 67.
For what? Oh, Expo 67?
Expo 67
Okay.
Montreal. And this was
Which is what, a World Fair or something?
A World Fair.
Okay.
Yeah, and this was a thing called the Gyrotron, which was a tetrahedral, which is an architectural pyramid. And it predates Spaceship Earth and Disney by 18 years. It's a track ride that goes all the way up inside this huge volume, and is supposed to sort of give the feeling of going into space. So he was very much pushing the boundary all the time on the stage, but also, unfortunately, a very poor businessman. And in the end,
yeah, that's important.
Yeah, and in the end, something takes us a long time to learn. In the end, his company basically fell apart. But I had already joined hands with two other people working with Kenny, and we founded a group called Media, which was very successful, very successful. And we made good money, and we found a whole possibility of working with advertising agencies in promoting new products. So we promoted everything from coffee, granulated coffee, to lingerie, to new cars, to old cars that were being kind of rust-proofing programs, and to food, to footwear, and you name it, but always inventing new things.
Okay.
In the same way that you would write a script and then illustrate it, use huge projection techniques, multiple slides being projected, being controlled by a computer for the first time, or simplified computer.
Well, it's cool how the various influences you had built upon each other.
This brings me on to what is really an interesting, in a way, design change. Because by the early 70s, or actually 1970, I was tired in a way of two-dimension. I was doing a lot of two-dimensional stuff.
Okay.
And I wanted to get back into three-dimension. And I interviewed with, and I won the role of a master planner for a large development company called Scotia Investments.
Okay.
And for 4.5 years, I basically worked almost exclusively for Scotia. First of all, designing discotheques.
What?
Discotheques,
Okay.
which are dance halls with food, bistrotheques.
Yeah.
And later beginning to get into retail, designing shop interiors, and designing various different entertainment components.
What's so cool about you and your experiences is that a lot of the stuff that is within society today, you've seen, you've been part of the production of, and it's been part of your life in a way that your day-to-day work is more culturing than someone else's might be if they just have a normal desk job.
Oh, that's definitely true. And where my fortunes lay, and I wasn't aware of this at the time, was that in 1972 I got a call one day to look at a castle.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, I was a bit suspicious about whether what the owner called a castle was probably just a large house or something.
Mm-hmm.
But I arrived in North Wales, a place called Abergele, to discover that not only was a castle, it was a giant castle, but it was a phony castle. It was a castle that had been built 2 centuries earlier, and as what the English call folly. It's a folly, meaning in a way it's a fake castle. So it had huge walls and battlements and gigantic home and house and everything, but it was not really a castle.
Mm-hmm.
Not in the sense of, it wasn't hundreds and hundreds of years old.
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of money that the client had to spend on this basically was very little. And they asked me what I thought I should do with it,
Mm-hmm.
to turn it into some kind of visitor attraction. And I said, destroy it.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, well, that's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
So well, you'll never have enough money to rebuild it.
Mm-hmm.
So by destroying it, we'll build battlements and we'll build wooden towers and we'll make it look like it's been a result of some war in the 13th century.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll put jousting knights. And they said, well, there was no such thing as jousting knights. I said, well, there can be, and there will.
Mm-hmm.
And the following year, we opened the project with jousting knights. And
So that came from imagination.
yes, purely. That was my interpretation of putting genuine medieval people, medieval characters, musicians and acrobats and actors and artisans and everything into the middle of this kind of castle environment.
Mm-hmm. They have something similar to that in Orlando now called Medieval Times.
Yeah, they do. Well, the medieval times actually sort of took the idea from us,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a later story.
Mm-hmm.
But by 72, 73, 74, I was so interested in the potential of medieval reenactment that I founded a company along with 3 other stuntmen out of the British film industry called the Company of Knights.
Mm-hmm.
And the Company of Knights literally was a company that went around Europe
Mm-hmm.
putting on huge shows,
Mm-hmm.
medieval shows, and being paid by burgomeisters and mayors of different towns.
This is a very irregular story.
Very irregular, but it was also a money-making venture, a huge potential money-making venture, because the spin-offs were basically not just the show, but the photographs from the show could then be used for promotional calendars, for desk diaries, for children's costumes, for games, for those sort of things.
Yeah.
And we could promote medieval products, soaps, perfumes, God knows what. And it got larger and larger, and eventually 60 people or so were involved in a sort of Barnum and Bailey kind of journey through, particularly through Europe, but eventually into America, Australia, Canada, and so on.
Yeah. And you mentioned that it could produce merchandise for kids, and
Yeah.
there's a guy in our club called Sean Tucker who said he thinks that Mel Brooks should win the Nobel Peace Prize for movies that he's made, which include Spaceballs, Robin Hood Men in Tights, Young Frankenstein, and
Exactly.
and I Spaceballs made my childhood, and a lot of the other movies that I've seen, like Star Wars, The Lion King, Aladdin, they were so special and important to me And I think that anybody who's making great stuff for kids deserves a pat on the back, because
Oh, yeah.
that when you're a kid, that is the most influential time of your life. And when you have like all this beauty when you're a kid, that carries forward through the difficulty of growing older, getting more
Sure.
mature, taking on more responsibility, seeing that things are not quite as good in the outside world as you may have thought when you were a kid in
Sure.
your house, seeing the nice movies. But that love that you feel in the beginning,
Yeah.
for me, has certainly helped, restore my faith in the goodness of the world, or the goodness of myself,
Yeah.
many times.
Well, I think everybody wants to be at times in a fantastic world. They want to travel outside their own environment,
Mm-hmm.
and children's costumes enable you to do that. I
Yeah.
mean, very recently I was in
Yeah.
Scotland, and I was in Archer in Hadrian's Wall, and there were a whole load of little Romans, and little kids all dressed up as Romans, and carrying Roman swords and little Roman helmets and everything, and that was all part of it. But the problem of, like many of the ideas that we've come up with, we were undercapitalized. We never had enough money to really lie back on our own laurels, so we
Mm-hmm.
were basically selling and at the same time spending for the next wave of whatever it happened to be. And that was the first shock for me, was that basically by the end of 1974 there was a very serious recession
Mm-hmm.
in England,
Mm-hmm.
and I knew I had to sell horses and
Yeah.
trucks and
Yeah.
get out of the business, because I knew that we couldn't carry on.
Mm-hmm.
And that led briefly to a period of about a 5-year period, working where I sold my company, and I allied it with a very large architectural engineering kind of company in London.
Mm-hmm.
And the client base became different. It was no longer purely an entertainment client. Became somewhat industrial
Mm-hmm.
client. And then, but I speak languages, I speak other languages, and I became, in this company, international director.
Mm-hmm.
And that meant that I started traveling in places like Africa.
Did the languages come from being in Europe, or did you have to spend extra time learning extra languages?
No, I think, if you live in England or you live on the edge of the continent, the next country next door is like Florida to Alabama.
Okay.
So if you imagine Alabama, they spoke French instead of English,
Mm-hmm.
there's a good chance that more people would speak French
Yeah.
who live here in Florida.
Right.
I went to a school where you learn French and German and Spanish and Latin and Greek.
Mm-hmm.
And I think my early travel, which were very much, I'd lived with a German family, for example, when I was only 16, and I travelled by bicycle through a good part of sort of Central Europe. That set me up to the idea that it wouldn't be so bad if you could learn more than one language. And so I learned French and I learned German, and later on I learned Greek and Italian, and to some extent Norwegian, because at one moment I was going to study medieval languages.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think you have to have a good ear.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be sort of somewhat of a songster
Mm-hmm.
as well to be able to pick it up.
Yeah, and it's unique of you. I mean, the full package is not just the languages, but being so well read. I've seen some of your drawings for your architecture. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Having this creative spark, and it shows me that it takes all types to make the world go round. Because these skills that you possess, all of the ones that I just mentioned, I don't have at all. I'm not good at drawing,
well,
and
I'm quite seriously missing a lot of skills myself. So, each of us has our own contribution to make. And I think that the contribution, I'm a sort of a pioneer in a way in entertainment architecture.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what I have done.
Well, you worked on Universal Studios City Walk.
Yeah, I did.
Did you design that?
Well, the answer is I immediately plunge in and say yes, but actually many people had a design role.
Mm-hmm.
I was at that time design director of a very large architectural firm,
Mm-hmm.
and so therefore, in a sense, I'm the head designer, but under me are other architects and other designers who are working on pieces of the project. The fundamental difference is, and I've held the role of design director or creative director for well over 40 years,
Mm-hmm.
working for what are well-known firms. And these well-known firms selected me because I think I had two things that I could think big.
Mm-hmm.
I could think very, very big and simplify in a way
That's
the
understandable.
complexity of the bigness.
Yeah, you can boil it down to themes,
Yes.
and then those themes can help motivate the people who are
Right.
seeking to execute the project.
And the other skill that I have was that I could draw. I could imagine in front of a client the evolution of a project.
Mm-hmm.
And
Do you
so,
think that the 12 hours a day that you spent working on Yellow Submarine and all of that enormous footwork that you've done helped lead you to be able to think in more
yeah.
visionary ways?
Oh, absolutely.
Like, for example, if you take out all that groundwork, could you have been could you have been just as visionary otherwise?
Well, you've got to be, you are an A type or a B type or whatever. I was definitely an A type.
Mm-hmm. And the distinction being...
I liked working. I still like working.
And
I still work.
Just to clarify, A-type is someone who's always trying to find new skills. And
Yes, and we don't need to be told what to do.
Okay. And
We don't need to hang around waiting to get instructions.
Mm-hmm.
The A-type normally knows what he's doing, and he's basically going to be self-motivating.
Okay.
It's a self-motivating kind of spirit, and that makes you get up and go.
The B-type is more passive, or more like,
Yeah.
would take instruction and...
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I think there are basically only two kinds of people. There's what I call the leaders
Mm-hmm.
and the led.
Mm-hmm.
So the leaders, which I feel have been a leader is a person who has a direct way of understanding what the challenges of the particular project
Mm-hmm.
and defining it
Mm-hmm.
in a way that yes, you need support depending on the scale and the size of the project, but if you lead the project, you lead from the front.
Mm-hmm.
You are prepared to take the pleasure and the pain.
Mm-hmm. And those pleasures and those pains would probably both be greater than if you were not in that position where your concerns are smaller.
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think there are some people, I mean, I know there are people who look upon work as sort of 9 to 5.
Mm-hmm.
People who they'll take an hour and a half for lunch if they can,
Mm-hmm.
that kind of thing. There are other people like me who there aren't enough hours in a day
Mm-hmm.
to do what you really want to do.
And it's important that, like I said earlier, that you have skill of drawing architecture and my skills are different. It's important that each person steps up to whatever the fullest of their own potential is in order to make things better for themselves and everyone around them.
No, I think that's true. That's totally true. And I think, if I fast forward and when I come to America, I came to America in 1980.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've been here 38 years, actually, 39 years. And in that period of time, I basically originally was looking at using my theme park skills and my jousting skills to help establish a project called Little England in Florida.
Okay.
And
They have a show called Little Britain now, by the
yes,
way.
well, there's lots of, England is still a little place, but
Yeah.
Little England was the concept of a self-made millionaire called Louis Cartier, and he had the idea that you could, a bit like Epcot in a way, you could visit England and know everything about it in one day.
Oh, okay, that'd be cool.
Yeah. So basically, this wasn't just a pipe dream. And this project had already begun before I even got involved in it. But I came to America initially, believe it or not, as a medieval historian, as a jousting expert, charged to buy the horses and put together a jousting team to do the project.
That was the first thing you came here for.
Yes.
And then you stayed.
Yes. And then I stayed because the client, I think, realized eventually that I got architectural skills, and suddenly I was doing kind of drawings that he didn't expect me to be doing, and I became creative director of Little England, and we built $14 million worth of English village in Kissimmee on a artificial hill. As part of stage one of a much, much bigger 50-acre theme park.
Okay.
And I designed 36 buildings of different periods of style. I designed all the rides and the attractions, and I designed costumes and promotions and publicity and you name it. And it was really fantastic. But again, sadly, in 1982, interest rates went to 18%, and they got to a point where the borrowing of the money, we were borrowing $70-odd million, what's called the net warranted investment, basically was destroyed by the cost of the dollar. Yeah. And the project stopped.
Right. Yeah. That might have been a really cool thing.
It would have been a very cool thing, and the tragedy was that we were 90% completed in the first phase. It was actually built. Okay. But the buildings were there, and they were there for several years while we were trying to figure out what to do with them.
And you could have had the Disney, it's near Disney, which is where in medieval times is also. Yeah. And that location is great.
Well, the keeping within that same theme still goes on, because I was later to do King Henry's Feast, which is a themed dinner dining theatre involving knights on knights, fighting knights, and that was for Robert Earl, who is the guy behind Planet Hollywood. So Robert had already known what I was doing in England, knew what I was doing for Little England, so basically I seemed to be the natural person to design something. Yeah. So I joined HHCP Architects and began to work on really big projects, and one of the projects was the very first version of Universal Studios here in Florida. And in addition to be the co-designer of the Shamu Stadium, the big killer whale stadium at SeaWorld.
It's a great stadium.
Which is a great stadium, even though I say it myself. It was a stadium entirely built for the whale that will be no more because of the problem of blackfish and genes and all the other things, the keeping of a giant killer whale in the care of man. Right, right. So HHCP, I joined in March of '82 with a mandate, and that was within a year and a half to make the firm international, to take it international. And as luck would have it, we achieved that with a project in France called the New World of the Smurfs. And I think you know the Smurfs are the
blue guys,
the blue guys.
They look like the meanies from the Beatles movie.
And I spoke French, so I got that job speaking French, really, and brought it into the company. And in about a year and a half, we were actually out of the job because the client spent all the money trying to develop the thing under a huge rolling mill, steel rolling mill. But that launched along with a project for Disney and the Universal Studios projects and SeaWorld, and the work that I'd already done in Britain. That launched the division of HACP. And I lasted with them for 10 years. And by the end of the 10th year, we were working in Japan, working in China, all over the world.
So, in all your travels, you've seen a lot, and you've talked to me about man's relationship with nature. Could you expound upon that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting subject.
There's a lot of nature surrounding this house, and visibly so. In the patio, there's ferns and flowers.
Yeah.
There's flowers here.
Well, I think you live in whatever nature you live in a sense. I know that sounds a bit obvious, but if you go to a very dry country, or even say to the southwest of America, you learn to live in a world of boulders and sand, and a world where the atmosphere is very dry, where there's very little water, and you change accordingly.
Well,
I think you adapt.
Cultural changes too over centuries.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
People in deserts, they wear stuff over their heads.
Exactly right. So not only the physical things that you wear, but actually you change yourself. Your skin changes and modifies. And obviously over huge periods of time you go darker or whiter depending on where you live, whether you live in the north or the south of the hemisphere.
Yeah.
And you look at people who come from, say, Sweden and Denmark or further north, Finland, parts of Norway, they're very blonde, very white skin, and they're not getting too much sun.
Yeah.
The other interesting thing is that I think we touched on the idea of the sort of the metaphysical. And for me, the metaphysical is this, is that the brain, which is obviously the human computer, is possible to live a parallel life. In other words, you can live this physical life. Today is in October 2018. Okay, but can you also at the same time be living in 1617, or can you be living in 1430?
As this specific person, or if your consciousness projects itself there?
Yes, and I think
which one?
Well, I think your consciousness is going to project that because you're not necessarily physically there, but you can be, to all intents and purposes, there in other centuries if you want to be, and you can clearly heighten that sense of being in past centuries by the clothes you wear or the environment in which you live. You can modify it.
And that might give inspiration for works that, as this person, you can end up doing if you're to write a play or talk about how culture was.
Well,
back
I think
then.
anybody, if you set your mind to it, you can do anything. I actually do believe that. Although I think there are people who, in early days, I was not very good at math. Okay, didn't really understand it, didn't really get with it, and eventually I had to do math. Architecture, to some extent, requires math. In those days, we have slide rules, not a computer, but a slide rule. So we could work out certain things with a slide rule. But math was always a mystery to me. But math is a language.
Right.
So if I was good at languages, I should have been good at math. I just didn't quite get with it.
I don't know if math is a language as such.
Well, I think a lot of, I think there are people. I saw fairly recently a film about some math genius
Mm-hmm.
to whom math is colours, and he's able to compute highly complex things by thinking about colours.
Okay.
Now, where does that come in? There's nothing in our training that says anything about that whatsoever.
Right.
So if you go back to India, for example, and you meet with the gurus or the mystics, and you meet with the lamas in Tibet, who will tell you that you can stop your heart for 20 minutes, or you can levitate, or whatever. The answer is, I might believe that.
Mm-hmm.
I might believe it.
Right, and while of course in every physical way, as far as we know, that totally is physically impossible, that's also based upon what we've experienced, what we know to be true.
Yes.
And they're realms and worlds beyond what we know.
Yeah, I think, again, truth is whatever you find it to be.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessarily what you're told.
Right.
It's what you find it to be. And I think that's one of the interesting things of when you travel. Because of a lot of travel, because I've got very accustomed sometimes to being in places where I'm warned that I should not be.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, don't go there, it's dangerous. And in fact, it probably is dangerous, but if you go there on the attitude that you're on the lookout to be careful, you can be in all kinds of amazing places, and nothing
And
will
it's
happen.
and it's not as dangerous as it may seem.
Right, and nothing will happen to you.
And that's how the mind views danger also. Like, and that's why when a bad experience happens to somebody, somebody replays it over and over and over in their head. Like if they got attacked by a bear and escaped, anytime they see a forest, they're going to think about bears, and it's going to feel real to them. And that leads to how people view dangerous areas and otherwise.
Well, you're certainly, once pre-warned about bears. If you're attacked by a bear, you're always going to be looking for that next bear. I tend to be more abstract in the way in which I think about the metaphysical part of your life.
Mm-hmm.
I can't say with any certainty, no more than anybody else can, that I have a soul that will somehow or another waft into another being.
Mm-hmm.
Do I come back as a frog? Do I come back as a seagull?
Mm-hmm.
Do I come back as Marilyn Monroe?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't say that at all. It's a nice idea that whatever one is not necessarily related to your human body, but I have no real way of knowing.
Right. Well, that's the sort of thing that you don't understand from the mind itself. Right. It gets brought back down to abstractions and logic. It's something that's felt more deeply.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about getting older is that you know what you like, and so therefore you know what you'll miss. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this stuff in the world today I wouldn't miss.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of places in the world I never want to go to again.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I constantly want to go to places where I feel good,
mm-hmm.
where I have related to indigenous people.
Is Greece one of those?
Yeah, it is. And one of the interesting things is that we live now in this technological world. If you just look around this room, you see televisions, you see all kinds of stuff.
Right.
We've got computers in our pockets. But do we really need them? And the alternative for me in Greece was that I could get much closer to nature than I ever got anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Firstly, I've written a lot about islands.
I've read some of your writing. It's very, very well written, descriptive. You capture scenery and emotions and people well.
Well, the island in particular, which is often the basis of what I write about, is an understandable thing because it is a defined frontier. There's an edge of land with the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
And islands don't have to be enormous. They can be quite small. I lived on an island which was 8 miles long. I lived 9 months on an island literally 8 or 9 miles long. And yet, even then, I did not travel more than probably 20% of the island.
Mm-hmm.
So I can live in a very small space with a very defined frontier. And I think once you live on an island, you understand the winds, you understand the smell, you understand many subtle things about human life that you don't get when you live here.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do I smell when I walk out? Is, exhaust gas
Mm-hmm.
or something.
Mm-hmm.
The smell of the local chip factory or
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different kind of environment. And I think that...
Well, I'm sure in general, though, the air you breathe here when you step outside is good and clean and...
Oh, yeah. It is, in general.
Yeah.
I mean, we're
Different than sea breeze, but...
Yeah, I mean, we're not. We're clearly... I mean, if you take Florida alone, which has got 2 oceans on either side, more or less we get clean air.
Mm-hmm.
We get washes from the west or the east, or whether with frequent rain that brings down anything that's kind of really bad. But going back again to this old world of the old
Yeah.
world, Mediterranean world, there is a sort of a politeness in the environment that somehow or another tells you, yeah, I'm just passing through. So, for example, there's one particular island that I think about a lot. It's in the Cycladic chain of islands. And in the highland, they grow barley. So that barley is used for making beer. And they still cut it with a scythe, with an ancient tool.
Mm-hmm.
And their life is no different than it's been hundreds and hundreds of years. They eat a basic form of cheese. They keep a few goats. They grow almost everything themselves. They survive on dried figs. They have tomatoes and other vegetables, but basically everything they eat comes from the land or the sea. They catch a fish, they kill it, they smoke it, they do whatever they do with it.
Did you actually saw this stuff happening?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I've been a part of it because in my early days in Greece, particularly, I traded. I was a trader.
Mm-hmm.
I worked for nothing. I worked because I enjoyed to work, but I enjoyed pulling nets, and I enjoyed taking fish out of nets, and I enjoyed getting given 5 or 6 fish, decent sized fish. And what do I do with these? I trade them, go into the town and trade one fish for a loaf of bread,
Mm-hmm.
another fish for some vegetables, and another fish for this and that. And they live very, very well at that basically local way. Raw honey scooped out of the hive.
Yeah. When I was in Argentina, my friend and I went to Iguazu Falls. Which
Yeah.
is have you been there?
No.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I
It's
do.
a beautiful, huge waterfall.
Oh yeah.
And there are these 2 Argentinian, and most of the area around it is indigenous. It's not developed. And there are these 2 Argentinian people who lived at the hostel, and maybe they owned it, and they were maybe in their late 20s, and they operated the hostel, and they made pizza and talked with the people who came by. And I felt at peace about them because this was their life. And it's being in America where there's so much to achieve and progress in and all these dreams and ambitions and everything that we have, which is in our minds very strongly, which I think is good in a lot of ways. It can be very stressful, and of course, I can't see inside the heads of these Argentinian people, but they may have discontentments that I don't know about.
They almost,
but it was beautiful.
In a way, they almost certainly do. One of the disappointing things for me about island life was that there's no intellectual discussions about anything.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's how are your chickens today?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how are your tomatoes growing? Are you getting good olives from your trees?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, there's that level, but when there's no exposure to anything that is outside an island, there is no comprehension about other events of the world
Mm-hmm.
which are going on. And we, you know, we're well educated. We can't be blind to that. We can't be blind. Every single day that goes by, we are covered by all kinds of stuff that's going on.
Information, yeah.
Today, a Russian rocket failed to reach orbit.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, 2 astronauts lucky to get out with their lives. Okay, there's a Saudi Arabian guy who was probably murdered in Istanbul, you know, yesterday. And what does that mean in terms of our relationship with so-called partner? On and on and on. And that's just information that's coming to us all the time.
And then even if we don't actively think about it, we will be thinking about it. Once a piece of information is in your head, there it is.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. So the thing is, at times there is an internal demand to go back to a sort of a primitive way of living.
Mm-hmm.
But it's very hard to do that for all that long.
Mm-hmm. Is that what you found when you were out there on the island?
I did. You did find it because
so you wouldn't want to live there.
You wouldn't want to live there all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And also you start missing things. You start, hey, I'd like to go to a movie. There are no movies. I'd like to buy a new book. Well, when do I buy a new book?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm talking about an age when you couldn't even, there was no Amazon. I mean,
right.
You can't, today you can order up anything and get it delivered to the front door.
Right.
But in those days, you are missing things, and you're missing people.
Mm-hmm.
You're missing the friends you have around you.
Yeah.
I mean, we made, my girlfriend and I, at that time, we made a big mistake. We actually thought we were going to be lonely. And we asked for friends of ours, you know, come and stay with us. Come and stay with us.
Wait, when you were in Greece?
Yeah, we were in Greece for this long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
And that was good and bad, because what happened was that we began to create a relationship with local people, and then the second these foreigners arrived, they felt like jealous, or, oh, well, you're not interested in us anymore, you're interested in your friends, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So basically, that whole interrelationship, living a kind of with an islander, is somewhat false.
Mm-hmm.
It could have never survived a year. It could not have survived a year. And people began to mistrust why you were there. You know,
Mm-hmm.
you're there, and it's not good enough to say I'm here because I like it.
Yeah. I mean, maybe it could though. Maybe it is.
Maybe. I mean, I'm completely, you know, on my wall up there, the camera can't see, is my eldest daughter
Mm-hmm.
in Tibet.
Yeah.
And those are prayer flags,
Okay.
which are flapping in the breeze. And I have traveled in Japan and in China, always looking for the non-Western expression,
Mm-hmm.
the local expression.
Mm-hmm.
To go to China or to go to Japan for example, and stay in a ryokan, which is a local inn with tatami mats and with rice paper walls and communal bathing and stuff like that. And you go, why? And it's actually much more rewarding than staying in a first-class hotel. Which is
What about it makes the experience richer? What do you get out of that?
I think you get out of it because you realize how subtle humanity is. Even though you could probably bake everything back to 5 or 6 main points, there are levels of subtlety within virtually everything.
Right.
How we speak to each other.
Yeah.
How the food that we eat and what it means.
Seeing other things can help you figure out how to make your own thing better also, because when you're unexposed to something, if you're to change something, it needs to come from your imagination.
Absolutely.
But the more exposure you have, the more you can imagine, and the more you can even replicate from what else you've seen.
No, I think that's absolutely true. That is true.
And it gives a sense of freedom too, because your life doesn't need to be exactly one way.
No, there is no correct way. I think all of us adapt to, as I said, to the environment, which is where we came in on this conversation, is that you live in an environment, maybe of your own choice, if you're lucky, and if you live in that environment and you are free to do whatever you think you can do, then you are going to adapt. I mean, Nikki and I, my wife, crossed America from Florida to California. And we didn't do it by walking, we did it by driving, but we spent significant hours stopping off at places that seemed to be meaningful to us.
Yeah.
And they went all the way back to places like Mesa Verde.
Where's that?
In Colorado.
Okay.
And Mesa Verde, where these basically virtually Neolithic people were living, actually even until 800 or 900 AD, living under huge caves.
Wow.
And one of the things that is sort of shocking in a way is to realize that we're all newcomers. In this country, we are all newcomers. And yet here is massive evidence of people who have lived thousands of years in North America.
Right.
Okay, genetically, we know where they came from. And you can get very sad when you look at, say, Indians, the tribal Indians, doesn't matter which tribe, and they're living in these beautiful places, and they're living in these awful shacks and shanty towns. They have no real work, they're all drinking like crazy, and they've inherited all the worst things of the white man. They are no longer free. They originally rode the plains.
Right.
They originally lived off the buffalo. They originally had this amazing system of language and symbols, and all of that's gone. And it's just falsely preserved now in Indian encampments. And so I'm very conscious of that and feel very sad that that's the negative side of white man's expansion.
Chris, thanks for sharing all your experiences from your life, about your work, your observations on the world, your travels. It's been amazing to talk to you about this in this conversation.
I really enjoyed it myself, and wish you very much the best for all of your endeavors.
Thank you, and I hope that anybody who's watching, you get another slice of life with Chris, and he's had a very varied life and going everywhere, and there's so much to learn from him. And
appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.